Protests in Georgia have lasted nearly 2 months. Despite the winter cold and harsh police crackdowns, thousands of people gather every evening on the streets of Tbilisi with the flags of Georgia and the European Union. The demonstrators are demanding the annulment of the results of the recent parliamentary elections, although in reality this is just a formal pretext. Today, no less than the future of this small post-Soviet country is being decided on the streets of the Georgian capital. The success of the protesters will determine whether Georgia becomes part of the civilized world or remains in the orbit of the Russian Empire. I am closely following the current events in Tbilisi, and it can already be said for certain that the current authorities have planted a time bomb. Georgia's path to true independence was long and bloody. And now it is probably standing at the most important crossroads in its history. Today, I will tell you how this thorny path began, about the tragic events of April 9, 1989, when Moscow tried to keep the rebellious republic in its orbit by force. My name is Semyon, this is MGSH TV. Let's begin. The collapse of the Red Empire. The process of the USSR's dissolution began somewhere in the second half of the 1980s, and by the end of the decade, the Red Empire was already bursting at the seams. National movements began springing up across the republics, demanding more and more rights from the center, and sometimes even calling for independence from Moscow. Usually, such calls were accompanied by anti-communist slogans. Moscow had nothing to respond to such challenges with. The Soviet economy, not just Russia, was in a deep crisis. Communist ideology had completely failed, and the repressive machine no longer worked. But a solution was found. Pockets of separatism began to be fomented in the republics, sparking sharp confrontations with the local authorities. The organization of such enclaves was handled by the KGB of the USSR, under the careful guidance of top party officials. This is how the foundations of the conflicts in Karabakh, Transnistria, and Abkhazia were laid. Georgian-Abkhaz relations have always been extremely complicated. However, things truly flared up when Moscow started adding fuel to the fire. On March 18, 1989, in the village of Likhny, a gathering of thousands of Abkhaz people took place, where the demand was made for Abkhazia to secede from Georgia and restore its status as a union republic. The reaction of the Georgians was predictable. Rallies numbering in the thousands swept across the entire republic. The Georgians, not without reason, saw the hand of Moscow in the escalation of Abkhaz separatism. That is why one of the main demands of the people's assemblies was for the republic to leave the USSR. The background of the events. On April 4, 1989, the opposition began an open-ended protest in Tbilisi. Its leaders were Zviad Gamsakhurdia, Mirab Kostova, Irakli Tsarevna, Georgi Tsareteli, Georgi Centuria, and Irakli Batiashvili. The center of the protest was Rustaveli Avenue in the very heart of the Georgian capital, near the government building. The demonstration was entirely peaceful. The protesters did not seize buildings, did not attack police officers or government representatives, and did not commit acts of vandalism or hooliganism. However, for the communists, the protesters' slogans were far worse than broken windows or Molotov cocktails. Down with Soviet power, down with the communist regime. Down with Russian imperialism. The USSR is a prison of nations. The protesters even drafted an appeal to the President and Congress of the United States, in which they asked them to recognize the fact of Georgia's occupation by the Bolsheviks in 1921, and to facilitate the republic's withdrawal from the USSR, introducing NATO troops or UN peacekeepers into its territory if necessary. On April 7th, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Georgia delivered a special address on the republic's state television, but it did not have much impact on either the protesters or the public situation in the republic. The leaders of the protesters, in turn, sent their representatives to educational institutions, schools, and labor collectives, calling for a strike and urging them to join the demonstration. The situation was clearly getting out of the authorities' control. However, they still refused to enter into a dialogue with the opposition. Instead, the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Republic, Jumber Patiashvili, turned to Moscow for armed support. He requested more forces from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of Defense for Tbilisi. On the same day, a meeting was held in Moscow, initiated by the KGB representative Chebrikov. It was decided to grant Patiashvili's request and send a contingent of internal troops and army forces to Tbilisi, supposedly to suppress mass riots. Interestingly, no minutes were taken at the meeting. Instructions were given only verbally. Formally, it turns out that the Minister of Defense and the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs sent troops to Georgia simply on their own initiative. However, the most interesting role in this bloody story belongs to Mikhail Gorbachev. According to the official version, he did not know about the planned dispersal of the rally. Later, the last Soviet General Secretary claimed that he demanded that the Georgian leadership find a political solution to the difficult situation that had arisen. But Patiashvili said something completely different in his interviews. He said that the General Secretary, in a tone that allowed no argument, ordered him that the square must be cleared immediately and that the army would take care of it. And this is not the only evidence that Gorbachev was at least aware of what was happening. For example, in an interview with Moscow News, when asked who gave the order to use the army, General Rodionov replied, "What if I say it was the General Secretary?" Much later, Chebrikov, referring to the events in Tbilisi, claimed that he constantly reported the situation to Gorbachev and requested his authorization to use the troops. Who, besides the Supreme Commander, could have given such an order, he wondered. The first deputy chairman of the KGB of the USSR, General Bobkov, claimed that not a single order was sent to Tbilisi without Gorbachev's approval. One way or another, on April 8th, a regiment from the Dzerzhinsky division, paratroopers from Kirovabad, fighters from the Voronezh and Permomon, as well as cadets from the higher school of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, were transferred to Tbilisi. According to the official version, the decision to forcibly disperse the rally was made at a meeting of the top Georgian party leaders and security officials with the participation of the commander of the military district, Igor Rodionov. No records were kept here either, and orders were given only verbally. The state commission that later investigated the events couldn't even determine the names of all those present for a long time. The only document they were able to find turned out to be an order from the chairman of the Council of Ministers of Georgia, Zurab Chaidze, ordering the Republican Ministry of Internal Affairs to take measures to remove the protesters from the areas adjacent to the government building. What can you say about that? The Bolsheviks, as always, knew how to cover their tracks. The night of the long shovels. A total of about 2,500 military personnel were involved in the operation, along with 6 armored personnel carriers, 8 airborne combat vehicles, 4 fire trucks, and 2 ambulances. However, about 900 troops directly participated in dispersing the rally, soldiers from the Dzerzhinsky division and a company of paratroopers. The Georgian police did not take part in the bloody events. Moreover, they tried to protect the demonstrators and get them out of the dangerous area. The authorities held a show of force the day before. Tanks drove through the streets of Tbilisi. In the evening, military helicopters flew at low altitudes over the city. However, this only caused irritation among the citizens and brought thousands more protesters to the square. To Patiashvili's credit, it should be said that he did make an attempt to avoid major bloodshed. At his request, the head of the Georgian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Ilya II, arrived at the rally and tried to persuade the protesters to disperse. However, the participants of the rally rejected his appeals, after which a violent crackdown began in the square. It was carried out in the harshest way possible. The operation was organized so that the protesters were not so much pushed out of the protest site as they were surrounded and blocked. The security forces were coming down from all the adjacent streets, and the passages to the Kura embankment were blocked by armored vehicles. Tear gas grenades were thrown into the crowd, after which panic and a terrible crush began. Rubber batons, entrenching shovels, and firearms were used against the demonstrators. The night of April 9 went down in history as the night of the entrenching shovels. As a result, 16 participants of the rally died on the spot, and 3 more soon died in the hospital. In total, 251 people were admitted to medical facilities in Tbilisi, of whom 183 were hospitalized. In most cases, the cause of death was suffocation as a result of a combination of inhaling chemical substances and chest compression in the crush. The next day, a state of emergency was declared in Tbilisi and a curfew was imposed. All opposition leaders were arrested, but after Eduard Shevardnadze arrived, they were released without any charges being brought against them. The outcomes of the events for Georgia. For Georgia, the events of April 9 became a turning point, a real point of no return, after which the republic was lost to the Soviet Union for good. The death of dozens of unarmed innocent people, most of them women, shocked Georgian society so much that the idea of independence became non-negotiable and uncompromising. Many in Georgia believed that it was the tragedy of April 9 that paved the way for the emergence of the Georgian state. Already the day after the bloody events in the center of Tbilisi, a nationwide strike began in Georgia as a protest against the actions of the security forces, and a 40-day mourning period was declared. The residents of the city began to lay flowers en masse at the site where the demonstrators died. On October 28, 1990, the first multi-party parliamentary elections in the USSR were held in Georgia, in which the national political forces won an overwhelming victory. On March 31, 1991, a referendum was held in the Republic on the issue of restoring state independence. 28.93% of voters voted for it. On April 9, 1991, 2 years after the events described, the Supreme Council adopted the Act on the Restoration of Georgia's Independence. And on May 26, 1991, the first presidential elections were held, in which Zviad Gamsakhurdia won. Investigation. At first, the central authorities tried to hush up the events in Tbilisi. However, nothing came of it, because they received too much public attention. Then the communists began to lie as usual. For example, the Soviet press kept silent about the use of poisonous gas against the demonstrators, as well as the use of entrenching shovels and batons by the troops against unarmed people. The deaths were attributed to the stampede. However, no one specified why this stampede started. The military claimed that the demonstrators attacked the soldiers first and that they were only defending themselves. Only one newspaper, Molodyosh Gruzi, dared to give a true picture of the tragedy that had occurred. The issue's circulation was seized and destroyed, and the editor and journalists of the newspaper faced serious problems. The Prosecutor General's Office of the USSR conducted an investigation into the events in Tbilisi. It placed the blame for the deaths entirely on the protesters themselves and their leaders. In addition, the prosecutor's report claimed that the demonstrators were planning to organize a pogrom against Abkhazians on April 9 and on the 14th to begin seizing power in the republic. However, times had changed, so the authorities were unable to lie about or cover up the tragedy, as they had done, for example, with the shooting in Novocherkassk. At the first Congress of People's Deputies of the USSR, an independent commission was created to investigate the events in Tbilisi. It was headed by Anatoly Sobchak. The commission studied a large number of documents and interviewed hundreds of witnesses, including generals and members of the Politburo, Ligachev, Chebrikov, Shevardnadze, and Yazov. The members of the commission were unable or did not dare to question Gorbachev. As a result, the commission considered the use of force excessive and the political means for resolving the conflict far from exhausted. It was also proven that the security forces used highly potent chemical agents and those very same ill-fated entrenching shovels. The commission found that the casualties occurred due to unsatisfactory planning of the operation. During its preparation, the large number of protesters was not taken into account, nor was the fact that most of the exits from the square were barricaded and blocked by troops, which caused a stampede and panic. Also, in the Commission's opinion, paratroopers should not have been involved in the operation, as they were trained to fight armed opponents, not to maintain public order. However, the Sobchak Commission was never able to determine who exactly gave the order to carry out the crackdown, since there was no documentary evidence regarding this. Responsibility. The worst thing about this story, of course, is that no one was ever held accountable for the deaths of these people. Colonel General Rodionov, who planned the dispersal of the rally, became the rector of the USSR Military Academy and later the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. Already in independent Russia, he was promoted to four-star general, and after retirement he entered the State Duma from Rogozin's Rodina bloc. In numerous interviews, he fully justified the actions of the military in Tbilisi and claimed that under Yeltsin, Russia was governed by America. How he managed the Ministry of Defense back then, only God knows. Potyashvili voluntarily resigned immediately after the tragic events, something unheard of for the Soviet nomenclatura. Then he quietly retired. In 2000, Potyashvili even ran for president, and later he was a member of parliament. He supported the Rose Revolution, probably because of his poor relationship with former President Shevardnadze. The head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Georgian SSR, Shota Gurgodze, also quietly retired, and no accusations were made against him. And the then head of the KGB, Givi Gumbaridze, even briefly led the republic. Conclusion: the death of demonstrators on the streets of Tbilisi shocked Georgian society. But unfortunately, this tragedy was only the beginning of a bloody series of further events. Over the next 30 years, Georgia had a difficult journey. The overthrow of the first president in 1992 civil war, conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the invasion of Russian troops in 2008. There were also highlights, such as the remarkable reforms led by Mikhail Saakashvili's team. In 2014, Georgia signed an association agreement with the European Union, and in 2023, it became an official candidate for EU membership. This unique opportunity appeared only because of Russian aggression against Ukraine. However, the current Georgian authorities seem to be doing everything possible to ensure that the country remains a satellite of Moscow. Therefore, just like 35 years ago, the fate of the Georgian people and their statehood is once again being decided on the streets of Tbilisi.
Goodbye, everyone.